The candle flickers. It's the only light in the room. Outside, there's nothing but darkness. No street lights. No car headlights. No glow from neighboring windows. Just an endless, suffocating black that presses against the walls like a living thing. You're in a small wooden house. The year is 1347. You're somewhere in Europe. It doesn't matter where. France, England, Germany. The darkness is everywhere. You pull your threadbare blanket tighter. Your stomach aches with hunger. You haven't eaten a proper meal in 3 days. Your children sleep beside you. They're breathing shallow and weak. One of them coughs, a wet, rattling sound that makes your heart clench with fear. In the distance, you hear church bells. They've been ringing all day. Death bells. Someone else has died. The third person this week in your village of barely 100 souls. You close your eyes and pray. Not for wealth, not for happiness. You pray for something simpler, something that people in the future will take for granted. You pray to survive until morning. This is life in the Dark Ages. Not a metaphor, not an exaggeration. The actual historical period between roughly 500 and 1500 AD, 1,000 years when darkness, in every sense of the word, seemed to swallow Europe whole. The Roman Empire had collapsed. The infrastructure, the knowledge, the order, all gone. Cities crumbled. Roads disappeared. Literacy plummeted. Medicine regressed to superstition. And into this vacuum of civilization crept horrors that would define an entire millennium. This wasn't just a time of ignorance and poverty. It was a time when the line between life and death was terrifyingly thin. When disease could wipe out entire regions in months. When justice meant being burned alive or drowned to prove your innocence. When children were sent to war. When people danced themselves to death. When the world itself seemed to be ending and no one knew why or how to stop it. The stories you're about to hear are not myths. They're not legends embellished over time. They're documented historical events, recorded by monks, chroniclers, and survivors, people who witnessed these horrors firsthand and wrote them down so we would never forget. Some of these stories will shock you. Some will disturb you. Some will seem too bizarre to be true. But they are true. Every single one. Welcome to the Dark Ages, where the darkness wasn't just outside. It was inside people's minds, their hearts, their understanding of the world. And what emerged from that darkness was more terrifying than anything they could have imagined. Let's begin. Trial by Ordeal, England, 1215. A woman named Emma stands in the village square. Her hands are bound. The entire village has gathered to watch. Children sit on their fathers' shoulders. Old women whisper prayers. The local priest stands beside a cauldron of boiling water, steam rising into the cold morning air. Emma has been accused of adultery. Her husband claims she was unfaithful. She denies it. There are no witnesses, no evidence, just his word against hers. So they will let God decide. The priest blesses the water. He prays over it, asking God to reveal the truth. Then he turns to Emma. If you are innocent, he says, God will protect you. Put your hand in the water and retrieve the stone at the bottom. If your hand is unburned, you are innocent. If it burns, you are guilty. Emma looks at the boiling water. She can feel the heat from where she stands. She knows what will happen. She knows her hand will burn. Everyone's hand burns in boiling water. But she has no choice. She steps forward. Trial by ordeal was the justice system in much of medieval Europe for centuries. The logic was simple. Humans lie. Witnesses can be bribed. Evidence can be fabricated. But God cannot be fooled. So if you wanted to know the truth, you didn't investigate. You asked God to reveal it through a physical test. There were many types of ordeals. Trial by hot water, plunge your hand into boiling water. If it heals within 3 days, you're innocent. Trial by hot iron. Carry a red-hot iron bar 9 paces. If your hand heals, you're innocent. Trial by cold water. You're bound and thrown into a river. If you float, you're guilty, because pure water rejects the guilty. If you sink, you're innocent, and hopefully someone pulls you out before you drown. Trial by combat. You fight your accuser. The winner is innocent. God ensures the righteous prevail. Trial by consecrated bread. Eat a piece of blessed bread. If you choke, you're guilty. These weren't rare exceptions. They were the standard legal procedure for serious crimes: murder, theft, adultery, heresy. Emma plunges her hand into the boiling water. The pain is instant and overwhelming. She screams. The water scalds her skin, turning it red, then white, then beginning to blister. She grabs the stone at the bottom, a smooth river rock, and pulls her hand out. The priest examines her hand. It's already swelling. The skin is peeling. She's sobbing, cradling her burned hand against her chest. The priest wraps her hand in bandages. "We will examine it in 3 days," he announces. If it has healed, God has shown her innocence. If it is still wounded, she is guilty. 3 days later, they unwrap the bandages. Of course, the hand hasn't healed. It's infected. The burns are worse. The flesh is red and oozing. The priest declares her guilty. The punishment for adultery is public humiliation, whipping, and sometimes branding. Emma is stripped to the waist, tied to a post in the square, and whipped while the village watches. Then a hot iron is pressed to her cheek, marking her as an adulteress for the rest of her life. She never committed adultery, but her hand burned in boiling water, so she must have. This was justice in the Dark Ages. Historical records are full of such cases. A man named Godric was accused of theft in 1090. He underwent trial by hot iron. His hand burned. He was hanged. Later, the real thief confessed. A woman named Ingrid was accused of witchcraft in 1180. She underwent trial by cold water. She sank, meaning she was innocent. But she drowned before anyone pulled her out. At least she died innocent. The most horrifying aspect wasn't the pain. It was the certainty. People genuinely believed God was speaking through these ordeals. If you were burned, you were guilty. If you drowned, you were innocent but dead. Either way, justice was served. The church eventually banned trial by ordeal in 1215, declaring it blasphemous to force God to perform miracles on demand. But by then, thousands had been burned, drowned, beaten, and executed based on how their skin reacted to boiling water. Trial by ordeal revealed the Dark Ages' fundamental problem: the absence of reason. Without scientific understanding, people turned to superstition. Without legal systems, they turned to God. Without evidence, they turned to pain. And countless innocent people suffered. Emma lived the rest of her life with a scarred face, marked as an adulteress, shunned by her community. She was innocent. But in the Dark Ages, innocence didn't matter. Only God's judgment mattered. And God's judgment, it turned out, looked a lot like boiling water. At least trial by ordeal was supposed to be divine justice. Painful but purposeful. A way to find truth. But what happened next had no purpose at all. No justice. No reason. Just hunger. Great famine of 1315 to 1317 Northern Europe. Spring 1315. It won't stop raining. For weeks now, the rain has fallen in cold, relentless sheets. The fields are flooded. The roads are rivers of mud. The crops that were planted in April are rotting in the ground. A farmer named Willem stands at the edge of his field, watching the water rise. His family's survival depends on this harvest. Without it, they have nothing. No food. No seeds for next year. no way to pay their taxes to the Lord. He prays for the rain to stop. It doesn't. May passes. June, July. The rain continues. The temperature drops. It feels more like autumn than summer. The wheat won't grow. The barley is diseased. The oats are drowning. By August, Willem knows there will be no harvest. And without a harvest, people will starve. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was the worst subsistence crisis in medieval European history. It began with unusual weather. The spring and summer of 1315 were the coldest and wettest in centuries. Crops failed across the continent. Then the winter was brutal. Then the next spring was just as bad. And the next. 3 years of failed harvests. 3 years of starvation. Medieval Europe had no food reserves. No global trade networks. No refrigeration. If the harvest failed, people starved. It was that simple. And the harvest failed everywhere, all at once. Historians estimate that between 10% and 25% of the population died. In some regions, it was worse. Entire villages were abandoned. Cities saw mass death. The social order began to collapse. This was the Dark Ages at its darkest, when nature itself turned against humanity, and there was nothing anyone could do. By the winter of 1315, the food was gone. Willem's family ate their seed grain, the grain they were supposed to plant in the spring. They had no choice. It was that or starve now. They ate their animals. First the chickens, then the pig they'd been raising, then, finally, their ox, the animal they needed to plow the fields. Without it, even if the weather improved, they couldn't farm. By spring 1316, they were eating grass, roots, bark from trees. Willem's youngest daughter died first. She was 4. Her name was Katrine. She simply grew weaker and weaker until one morning she didn't wake up. Her body was so light when Willem carried her to the churchyard, like she was made of paper. His wife died next. Then his son. Willem survived. He didn't want to. The chronicles from this period are filled with horror. A monk in Flanders wrote, the people ate dogs, cats, the dung of doves, and even their own children. That last part isn't metaphor. There are documented cases of cannibalism during the Great Famine. In 1316, in the city of Tournai, a man was executed for killing and eating his own children. In Ireland, chroniclers reported that people dug up corpses from graveyards to eat them. The social fabric tore apart. Bands of starving people roamed the countryside, robbing and killing. Parents abandoned their children because they couldn't feed them. The elderly were left to die. Crime skyrocketed. In the city of Ypres, 2,794 bodies were collected from the streets between May and October 1316. They'd simply died of starvation where they fell. A chronicler in Germany wrote, the living could scarcely bury the dead. Mothers smothered their infants rather than watch them starve slowly. One account describes a woman in Normandy who was found dead in her home, her mouth full of grass, her stomach bloated from eating things humans can't digest. The famine didn't discriminate. It killed peasants and nobles, young and old, pious and sinful. If you couldn't eat, you died. And there was nothing to eat. The Great Famine finally ended in 1317, when the weather normalized and harvest resumed. But the damage was permanent. Millions had died. The population of Europe wouldn't recover for generations. The economy was shattered. Trust in authority, the church, the nobility, the king was broken. How could God let this happen? How could the lords protect their people if they couldn't even feed them? The famine set the stage for even greater horrors to come. It weakened the population, making them vulnerable to disease. 30 years later, when the Black Death arrived, it found a population still recovering from starvation, still weak, still traumatized. Willem survived the famine, but he never recovered. He lived another 20 years, working fields that once belonged to his neighbors who had all died. He never remarried, never had more children. He'd buried too many already. When he died in 1336, he was buried in the same churchyard as his wife and children. The same churchyard where thousands of others from his village lay in unmarked graves, victims of the rain that wouldn't stop. The famine showed how fragile life was in the Dark Ages, how quickly everything could fall apart, how close to the edge of survival everyone lived. But at least the famine was natural. A disaster, yes, but not anyone's fault. What came next was different. What came next was deliberate cruelty, justified by faith and fear. The Blood Libel Massacres, Norwich, England, 1144. A boy's body is found in the woods outside the city. His name was William. He was 12 years old. He'd been missing for 3 days. The body shows signs of violence, wounds, bruises. The local sheriff begins an investigation. Who killed William? Why? Then a monk named Thomas of Monmouth makes a claim that will echo through history. The Jews killed him, Thomas says. They murdered him as part of a ritual. They needed Christian blood for their Passover ceremonies. It's a lie, complete fabrication. There's no evidence, no witnesses, no logic, but it doesn't matter. The mob believes it, and the Jews of Norwich are about to pay. Blood libel. The accusation that Jews murdered Christian children to use their blood in religious rituals was one of the most persistent and deadly lies of the Middle Ages. It started in Norwich in 1144 and spread across Europe like a disease. Whenever a child died under mysterious circumstances, Jews were blamed. Whenever people needed a scapegoat for their problems, plague, famine, economic hardship, Jews were blamed. The accusations were always the same. Jews kidnapped Christian children, tortured them in mockery of Christ's crucifixion, drained their blood, and used it to make Passover matzo. None of it was true. Jewish law explicitly forbids the consumption of blood. The entire concept was theologically impossible. But truth didn't matter in the Dark Ages. Fear mattered. Anger mattered. And when people were afraid and angry, they needed someone to blame. The Jews of Norwich knew what was coming. They'd heard the rumors spreading through the city. They'd seen the way people looked at them in the streets. They'd heard Thomas of Monmouth preaching his lies from the church pulpit. They barricaded themselves in their homes. They sent messages to the sheriff, begging for protection. The sheriff did nothing. On the night of March 24th, 1144, the mob came. They broke down doors, dragged families into the streets, beat them, stabbed them, set fire to their homes. A man named Isaac tried to protect his family. He stood in his doorway with a kitchen knife, facing a mob of 50 men. They beat him to death with clubs. Then they entered his house and killed his wife and 3 children. By morning, the Jewish quarter of Norwich was destroyed. At least 6 people were dead. Dozens more were injured. The survivors fled the city, leaving everything behind. And this was just the beginning. The blood libel accusation spread. Within 50 years, similar massacres had occurred in Gloucester, Bury St. Edmunds, and Lincoln. Each time, a child died. Each time, Jews were blamed. Each time, the mob attacked. The worst massacre happened in 1190 in York. The entire Jewish community, about 150 people, took refuge in Clifford's Tower, a stone keep overlooking the city. The mob surrounded the tower. They demanded the Jews convert to Christianity or die. The Jews refused. The mob set fire to the tower's wooden doors. As the flames spread, the Jews inside made a terrible choice. They would die on their own terms, not the mob's. Families held each other. Fathers killed their children to spare them the agony of burning alive. Then the men killed themselves. By the time the mob broke through, most of the Jews were already dead. Those who survived were pulled out and murdered. A chronicler wrote, "The Christians rejoiced at the destruction of the Jews and gave thanks to God." Blood libel accusations continued for centuries. They sparked massacres in France, Germany, Spain, Poland. Thousands of Jews were murdered based on lies about child sacrifice and blood rituals. The accusations were so persistent that in 1247, Pope Innocent IV issued a papal bull explicitly stating that the charges were false, that Jews did not use Christian blood in any ritual, and that Christians should stop murdering them. It didn't help. The massacres continued. The lies continued. The fear and hatred continued. The blood libel revealed something fundamental about the Dark Ages. Evidence didn't matter. Truth didn't matter. What mattered was fear, and fear could justify anything. William of Norwich, the boy whose death started it all, was later declared a saint, a martyr. Churches were built in his honor. Pilgrims visited his tomb. He became a symbol of Christian innocence destroyed by Jewish evil. He was 12 years old. He was probably killed by a random criminal or died in an accident. But his death was used to justify the murder of thousands. The blood libel massacres showed how superstition and hatred could turn neighbors into murderers, how quickly civilization could collapse into mob violence. But at least those victims died quickly. Violently, yes. Unjustly, yes. But quickly. What came next was different. What came next involved suffering that lasted for hours, sometimes days. And it was done in the name of healing. Medieval surgery without anesthesia, London, 1346. A man named John sits in a barber surgeon's shop. His leg is broken, badly. The bone has pierced the skin. The wound is infected. He can smell it, a sickly sweet rot that makes his stomach turn. The barber surgeon examines the leg. He shakes his head. "The leg must come off," he says. "If we leave it, the rot will spread. You'll die." John nods. He understands. He's seen men die from infected wounds. He's seen the fever take them, the delirium, the slow decay. Better to lose the leg than die. When? John asks. Now, the surgeon says. He calls for his assistants. For strong men enter. They hold John down, one on each limb. The surgeon picks up his saw. There is no anesthesia, no painkillers, no way to make this easier. John is about to experience agony beyond imagination, and he has to be awake for all of it. Medieval surgery was barbaric by modern standards, but not because surgeons were incompetent or cruel. They simply had no way to manage pain. Anesthesia, as we know it, didn't exist. Opium was available, but rare and expensive. Alcohol helped, but not much. Some surgeons used soporific sponges soaked in herbs like mandrake and hemlock, but these were unreliable and often killed the patient. So most surgery was performed on fully conscious patients who felt every cut, every bone saw, every cauterization. And yet, surgery was sometimes necessary. Broken bones had to be set. Infected limbs had to be amputated. Arrows had to be removed. Bladder stones had to be cut out. The choice was simple: endure unimaginable pain for a few minutes, or die slowly over days or weeks. Most people chose the pain. The assistants hold John down. The surgeon ties a leather strap around John's thigh just above the break. This will slow the bleeding. Then he takes his saw, a curved blade with coarse teeth, designed for cutting through bone. He begins. John screams. The pain is instant, overwhelming, all-consuming. It's not like anything he's ever felt. It's not like a cut or a burn. It's deeper, wronger, The saw is cutting through his flesh, through muscle, through bone. He tries to pull away. The assistants hold him tighter. One of them puts a leather strap in his mouth. "Bite down," he says. The saw moves back and forth. Each stroke sends fresh waves of agony through John's body. He can hear the bone crunching. He can feel the vibrations through his whole body. He passes out. The surgeon slaps him awake. "Stay with us," he says. "We're almost done." But they're not almost done. The saw is halfway through the bone. It takes time to cut through a femur. John vomits. He's crying. He's begging them to stop. But they can't stop. If they stop now, he'll bleed to death. Finally, the saw breaks through. The leg comes free. But the horror isn't over. The surgeon takes a red-hot iron from the brazier. He presses it against the stump, cauterizing the wound. The smell of burning flesh fills the room. John's screams reach a new pitch. The assistants have to use all their strength to hold him down. Then it's over. John lies on the table, shaking, sobbing, his leg gone, his stump a charred mess of burned flesh and blood. The surgeon bandages the wound. "You did well," he says. "Rest now. If you survive the next 3 days, you'll live." If you survive, because infection is still a risk. Blood loss is still a risk. Shock is still a risk. John survived. Many didn't. Historical accounts of medieval surgery are filled with descriptions of patient suffering. A French surgeon named Henri de Mondeville wrote in 1306, "The patient's cries are so terrible that the surgeon must have a strong heart." Many patients preferred death to the knife. A chronicle from 1403 describes a knight who had an arrow removed from his chest without anesthesia. He bit through his own tongue during the procedure. He survived the surgery but died 3 days later from infection. The most horrifying procedures were lithotomies, operations to remove bladder stones. The patient was held down while the surgeon cut into the perineum, reached into the bladder with his fingers, and pulled out the stone. The procedure took 10 to 15 minutes and was described by one patient as the most exquisite torture imaginable. Many patients died not from the surgery itself, but from shock, their bodies simply shutting down from the overwhelming pain. Medieval surgeons knew this. They worked as quickly as possible. Speed was the only mercy they could offer. A good surgeon could amputate a leg in under 5 minutes. A great surgeon could do it in 3. 3 minutes of hell, but 3 minutes that might save your life. At least surgery, however brutal, was intended to help, to heal, to save lives. But what if death came even more suddenly? Children, innocent children, would become victims of one of the most tragic episodes in medieval history. The Children's Crusade of 1212 Northern France, June 1212. A boy named Stephen stands in a field outside the village of Cloyes. He's 12 years old, thin, dirty. His clothes are rags, but his eyes burn with conviction. God spoke to him, he says, appeared to him in a vision, gave him a mission: lead the children of France to the Holy Land. Where adult crusaders have failed, children will succeed. Their innocence will part the Mediterranean Sea. They will walk to Jerusalem on dry land. They will reclaim the holy city without violence, through faith alone. People laugh at first. A child leading a crusade? Absurd. But Stephen is charismatic, passionate, convincing, and people are desperate. The adult crusades have failed. Jerusalem remains in Muslim hands. Maybe, just maybe, God really has chosen this boy. Within weeks, thousands of children follow Stephen. Some are as young as 6. Most are teenagers. They come from villages and farms, abandoning their families, convinced they're doing God's work. They march south toward the Mediterranean, singing hymns, waving crosses, believing that a miracle awaits them. They have no food, no money, no plan beyond faith, and they're walking into a nightmare. The Children's Crusade of 1212 is one of the most tragic episodes of the Middle Ages. Two movements emerged almost simultaneously, one in France led by Stephen of Cloyes, one in Germany led by a boy named Nicholas. Both claimed divine visions. Both promised miracles. Both attracted thousands of followers. The exact numbers are debated, but chronicles suggest between 15,000 and 30,000 children participated. Most never made it home. The movement revealed the desperation of the age. People believed so strongly in miracles, in divine intervention, that they sent their children to almost certain death, hoping God would protect them. He didn't. The French Children's Crusade marched south through the summer heat. They had no supplies, no organization, no adult supervision worth mentioning. They begged for food in villages along the way. Some villagers helped. Others drove them away. Children began dying within days. The youngest couldn't keep up. They collapsed by the roadside, exhausted, dehydrated. Their companions left them behind. There was no time to stop. God was waiting in Jerusalem. A chronicle from the time describes the roads of southern France lined with small bodies. Children who died from hunger, from heat stroke, from disease. But the survivors kept marching. Their faith was unshakable. They reached Marseilles in late July. Thousands of children, filthy and starving, standing on the beach, waiting for the miracle. Stephen raised his arms and commanded the sea to part. Nothing happened. He tried again and again. He prayed. He wept. He begged God to fulfill the promise. The sea remained unchanged. The children stood on the beach, confused, heartbroken. They'd walked hundreds of miles. They'd watched their friends die. They'd abandoned their families. All for this moment. And there was no miracle. Some children gave up. They tried to walk home. Most died on the journey. Those who made it back found their families destroyed. Parents who'd lost their farms, been evicted, or died in their absence. But thousands remained in Marseilles, stranded, desperate. That's when the merchants appeared. Two men, Hugh the Iron and William the Pig, names recorded in chronicles, offered to help. They had ships, they said. They would transport the children to the Holy Land for free, out of Christian charity. The children boarded the ships. 7 ships, thousands of children. The ships set sail. They didn't go to Jerusalem. According to a chronicle written 18 years later by a French monk, the ships sailed to North Africa. The merchants sold the children to Muslim slave traders. All of them. Thousands of children sold into slavery. Some were bought by wealthy families and became household servants. Some were sent to work in mines or on farms. Some, the girls especially, were sold into harems. Most were never heard from again. A few, a very few, eventually escaped or were ransomed and made it back to Europe years later. One of them told the story to the monk, which is how we know what happened. The German Children's Crusade ended similarly. Nicholas led his followers over the Alps into Italy. Thousands died in the mountains. The survivors reached Genoa, where again no miracle occurred. Some made it to Rome, where the Pope told them to go home. Most died trying. The Children's Crusade revealed the darkest aspects of the Dark Ages, the exploitation of faith, the vulnerability of the innocent, and the willingness of adults to send children to their deaths for religious ideology. Thousands of children died. Thousands more were enslaved, all because a boy said God spoke to him, and people believed. The Children's Crusade showed how faith, twisted by desperation and superstition, could lead to tragedy. But there was one final horror of the Dark Ages that combined all the elements we've seen: mass suffering, social hysteria, religious mania, and physical agony. It was called St. Anthony's Fire, and it turned entire villages into living nightmares. Ergot poisoning St. Anthony's Fire, a village in France, 994 AD. It starts with tingling in the fingers and toes. A woman named Adele notices it first, a strange sensation like pins and needles. She shakes her hands, thinking they've fallen asleep. But the feeling doesn't go away. By evening, it's worse. Her hands feel like they're burning. She plunges them into cold water. It doesn't help. The burning intensifies. By midnight, she's screaming. Her husband tries to help. He wraps her hands in wet cloth. He prays. Nothing works. The burning spreads up her arms, into her legs. She feels like she's on fire from the inside. By morning, her fingers have turned black. And she's not the only one. All across the village, people are screaming, convulsing, hallucinating, their limbs turning black and falling off. The village is being consumed by invisible fire. St. Anthony's Fire, also called ergotism, was caused by a fungus called ergot that grew on rye and other grains. When people ate bread made from contaminated grain, they ingested powerful alkaloids, natural chemicals that constricted blood vessels and affected the nervous system. The results were horrific. There were two forms: gangrenous ergotism. Blood flow to the extremities was cut off. Fingers, toes, hands, feet, even entire limbs would turn black and die. They would literally fall off the body. Victims felt like they were burning alive, hence fire. Convulsive ergotism. Victims experience seizures, hallucinations, psychosis, and muscle spasms. They would see demons, feel insects crawling under their skin, lose touch with reality. Outbreaks occurred throughout the Middle Ages, killing thousands. The worst outbreak, in 944 AD, killed an estimated 40,000 people in France alone. People had no idea what caused it. They thought it was divine punishment, a curse, demonic possession. They called it St. Anthony's Fire because victims would travel to the shrine of St. Anthony seeking healing. Sometimes it worked, not because of miracles, but because the journey meant they stopped eating the contaminated grain. Adele watches her fingers turn black. First the tips, then the whole finger. The flesh dies, becomes necrotic. The smell is overwhelming, rotting meat, but the meat is her own body. The pain is constant, unrelenting, like her hands are being held in fire every moment of every day. Her husband tries to care for her, but he's sick too. The burning has started in his feet. He can barely walk. Their children are hallucinating. Their daughter, 8 years old, screams about demons in the corners of the room. She claws at her own skin, trying to get the invisible insects out. Their son has seizures. His body convulses violently. He bites his tongue so hard it bleeds. The village priest tries to help. He performs exorcisms. He blesses the sick. He prays for hours. Nothing works. People are dying. Not quickly, slowly, over days and weeks. Their bodies literally falling apart. One man's foot falls off while he's walking, just detaches and drops to the ground. He stares at it, unable to comprehend what he's seeing. A woman's hand comes off when her husband tries to help her out of bed. The blackened hand simply separates from the wrist. She doesn't even scream. She's too exhausted from pain. A chronicle from the time describes the horror. The people were afflicted with a loathsome rot, so that their limbs were loosened and fell off before death. Many were consumed by the sacred fire, which blackened their limbs like coal. Entire villages were affected. In some places, half the population died. The survivors were left maimed, traumatized, often insane from the hallucinogenic effects. Ergot poisoning continued to cause outbreaks for centuries. It wasn't until the 17th century that people began to connect it to contaminated grain. And it wasn't until the 19th century that the specific fungus was identified. By then, thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, had died from St. Anthony's fire. The condition also may have contributed to other historical events. Some historians believe ergot poisoning played a role in the Salem witch trials. The hallucinations and convulsions could have been mistaken for demonic possession. Others suggest it contributed to the dancing plague we discussed earlier. Ergot contains LSA, a compound closely related to LSD. In the right or wrong doses, it could cause mass hallucinations and psychosis. The Dark Ages were dark enough without hallucinogenic fungi in the bread. But that's what people faced. A world where even eating could kill you in the most horrifying ways imaginable. Adele survived, but she lost both hands and 7 fingers. She lived another 20 years, unable to care for herself, dependent on others, a living reminder of the invisible fire that had consumed her village. The candle has burned down. You're still in that small wooden house, still in the Dark Ages. But now you understand what that really means. It means living in a world where justice is determined by boiling water, where children are sent to die in holy wars, where bread can make your limbs fall off, where you can be buried alive during a plague, where the rain won't stop and millions starve, where dancing becomes a plague, where your neighbors can murder you based on lies and fear. The Dark Ages weren't just dark because of lack of electricity. They were dark because of lack of understanding. Without science, people turned to superstition. Without medicine, they turned to prayer. Without reason, they turned to violence. And the suffering was immense. But here's what's important to remember. These weren't monsters. These were people. People like us. They loved their families. They hoped for better futures. They tried to make sense of a world that seemed determined to destroy them. They just didn't have the tools we have, the knowledge, the medicine, the systems of justice, and reason that we take for granted. The Dark Ages teach us something crucial. Civilization is fragile. The line between order and chaos is thinner than we think. When disease strikes, when food runs out, when fear takes over, society can collapse quickly. We've seen it in these stories. We've seen how quickly people turned on each other during the Black Death, how easily faith became exploitation in the Children's Crusade, how superstition led to massacres during the blood libel accusations. But we've also learned. We've built systems to prevent these horrors. We have anesthesia now. We have evidence-based medicine. We have scientific agriculture that prevents famines. We have legal systems based on evidence, not ordeal. We understand disease. We can treat ergot poisoning. We don't send children to war in the name of God. The Dark Ages ended. Not suddenly, not completely, but gradually over centuries. Humanity clawed its way out of the darkness. We learned to question, to investigate, to demand evidence, to value reason over superstition. We learned that burning people doesn't solve problems, that torture doesn't reveal truth, that faith without reason leads to tragedy. We learned these lessons through suffering, through the deaths of millions, through centuries of darkness. And we must never forget them, because the capacity for darkness is still within us. The same fears that drove medieval mobs still exist. The same superstitions that led to witch hunts still appear in different forms. The same cruelty that justified trial by ordeal still surfaces when people are afraid and angry. The Dark Ages aren't just history. They're a warning about what happens when we abandon reason, when we let fear override compassion, when we stop questioning and start accepting. The people in these stories couldn't help being trapped in the Dark Ages. They were born into that world. But we can help it. We can choose light over darkness, knowledge over ignorance, compassion over cruelty. We can remember Emma, burned by boiling water for a crime she didn't commit, and fight for justice based on evidence. We can remember Willem, burying his children during the famine, and support systems that prevent starvation. We can remember the Jewish communities massacred by blood libel, and stand against hatred and scapegoating. We can remember John, screaming through surgery without anesthesia, and be grateful for medical progress while pushing for more. We can remember the millions who died in the Black Death and support public health and scientific research. We can remember Maria, buried alive, and the children sold into slavery, and Adele, watching her hands turn black. And we can vow to never let such horrors happen again. The Dark Ages happened. They were real. The suffering was real. The terror was real. But they ended. And they ended because people chose to change, to learn, to build something better. We live in that better world now. Not perfect, not without darkness, but better. And it's our responsibility to keep it that way, to keep learning, keep questioning, keep pushing back against the darkness. Because the alternative, the world of dancing plagues and trial by ordeal and children's crusades and St. Anthony's fire, is always there, waiting if we forget. So remember these stories. Remember the suffering. Remember the victims. And remember that we have the power to ensure that the dark ages stay in the past where they belong. If you found this video enlightening, if these stories moved you or taught you something, please like and subscribe. Share this video with others. These stories need to be told. These lessons need to be remembered. And let me know in the comments, which of these stories affected you most? What other dark periods of history should we explore? Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for choosing light over darkness.